say the sea keeps its own calendar. On some nights it moves like a slow, inexorable clock, hands sweeping tide lines across the rocks, counting in surf and spray. On others, it snaps like a gear, hurling hours and histories into the dark. South Stack had all types of weather. It kept its own harsh time, and everyone who lived near it learned to measure their lives by the lighthouse's beam. Evan Reese had the measurement of it running through his blood. He'd been born in a row of whitewashed cottages that clung like gulls to the rim of Holy Island. As a boy, he'd raced the wind along the cliff path and pretended the basalt escarpments were ships. When he was old enough to walk without thinking of falling, he learned to count the stone steps, 390-something, depending on whether the tide had stolen the gravel that day, and to jump, 2 at a time, down the longer rises. The bridge, a narrow steel truss that hummed in the wind, had always sounded like a stringed instrument to him, a note you could tune yourself to if you listened close enough. He'd become a keeper because it felt like the only honest way to pay back the sea. There was a dignity in keeping a light for others. It was in his family the simplest form of kindness. His grandfather had been a man of the crew, a pilot who knew every shoal and seam. His grandmother had the stories. In winter, when the house smelled of stew and coal, she'd tell of a world when ropes and baskets were the only way across, when the first keepers were lowered into the fog in hemp slings. Evan grew up with those images, a man in a basket swaying over the maelstrom, a bell hung to warn the blind, a wheel that creaked like an old man turning his pocket watch. He took up the keeping in the autumn of a year that had taught the island to be suspicious of weather. Autumn was always clever at hiding its intent. It would tiptoe in with bright days and then spring the weather on a single winter's night. Evan's appointment was meant to be temporary, one of those cover gigs the authorities arranged when a keeper fell ill or moved away. But 3 months became a year, and the year folded into 2. He liked the meticulousness of the tasks, oiling fixtures, polishing glass, charting fog. It was unromantic work until the sea demanded romance, in the form of wrecks and men clinging to kelp. Then it became the kind of work that altered a man. The keepers had rules: never take the light for granted, keep the ledger, check the clockwork. They called themselves a line, a succession of shoulders and hands, passing the lamp like a baton. But rules can rust. Loneliness is quietly corrosive. The island was beautiful enough to make a man forget why he had come. It could make a man saturnine too. There was something about the sea's note that made memories thin and fragile, like pages that get washed away between storms. It was on a night like that, fog thick as wool and wind tasting of iron, that the first knock came. Evan was below in the engine room, checking the clockwork that fed the lantern's rotation. The sea had been uneasy all evening. The small boats moored in the bay had their sails tied tight, and the fishermen had lit no fires on shore. He'd been thinking of his grandmother's stories, the basket, the rope, when a sharp, polite rapping echoed down the hollow stair. Single knocks, 3, then a pause, and a hurried patter that sounded like someone trying a handle. He paused, wrench in hand. The ladder hummed as if something small had clattered over it. The light above him swung in its slow, patient arc, and the fog swallowed the beam in mouthfuls. He climbed the stairs with the kind of measured breath that keeps a man's balance when his heart wants to leap. At the top, the lantern room was empty, save for the electric glass and the brass, the sensor lights blinking their small modern constellations. The door to the gallery was bolted shut from the inside, a ritual of the keepers for safety. He opened it, expecting the wind to have found purchase and nothing more. The balcony was empty. The oily air smelled faintly of salt and the lamp of its own cleaning cloths, like the vague domestic smell of a church. "It's the wind," he told the sea and his own hands. Still, the knocks had been too articulate. too much like a human fist coming up against a door. He went back to his ledger and tried to catalogue the incident. Keepers write things down. Even the smallest details become part of a ledger's patience. Later, they are mapped onto other nights and become patterns. But that night, his entries looked like lines in an unfinished sentence. He wrote, 3 knocks, gallery door, empty. The next week was a catalogue of small anomalies. Boots that had been left drying in the porch were found lined up beneath the stove. A teacup, his favourite, chipped on the rim, would reappear in the lantern room whether he had put it away or not. Once, while he was below, someone whistled softly and then hummed an old working tune through the stone. Evan climbed up to find the landing empty. He began to speak aloud to the place, a ridiculous practice. "Hello? Who's there?" His voice bounced back at him rough, as if surprised to have been used at all. It was an old story, though, this idea of hands knocking on the lighthouse. The elders in the villages outside the cliff path had always talked about Jack. In the winter, when the sea ate the light from shore, and all you had was the shadow of the tower on the clouds, people would lower their voices and say the name as though it were a talisman. Jack. Jack Jones. The versions grew in the telling, like nets, mended and remended. Some said he'd been a young man taken by the sea while trying to lower a basket during a storm. Others said he was struck by falling rock as he tried to return from the cliff top, his skull broken, and his knocks thereafter desperate and perpetual. There were variations, dates, minor details, but all agreed on one thing, that he was a keeper and that he had never really let the light go. Evan tried to keep skeptical company with the facts. The lighthouse was a 19th century building, built to warn of the shoals that lay hidden like old teeth off the coast. It had been automated after his grandfather's time, and most of the mechanical rituals had been modernized. Men and women had died on these rocks. The sea keeps a ledger of its own, one that no human hand can read without blisters. But still, at midnight, he would wake at the sound of someone padding along the gallery and feel, in the grain of his bones, the presence of another footfall. One evening, a party of visitors came down the cliff path. 2 couples from the mainland, the sort who took photographs of wind-bent grasses, and later, at the pub, spoke of the island as if they had been further afield than they actually were. They were guide-led, and the guide told stories menacing and quaint. The keepers of old, she said, had to be tenacious. Once, when the storms came, they'd lower provisions in baskets. There are records, impossible rescues. She smiled at the tourists when she said impossible, as though the word itself was the reason they had come. Evan answered her questions with polite economy, and then listened as they dispersed along the path. The tourists took pictures of the rope bridge and the rock, oblivious to how the bridge creaked its own language in the wind. As they left, one of the women, an older sort with a weathered, quick face, called back, "You keep him well, do you?" and tapped her temple with a finger. An old joke about lads who watched lights all night and had their heads turned by storms. "Who?" Evan asked. "The old keeper," she said, "the one who knocks." He did not know whether to laugh, so he said, "We keep the light." The woman's eyes were not unkind. "Mementos," she said. "Places keep their histories." That night the knocking began in earnest. It was a ferocious thing, less polite than the first, more like anger than memory. It started as a steady, urgent tapping and grew into a battering. Evan felt in the vinegar-sour air the lightness of panic. He wrapped himself in his coat and ran up the stair, expecting to find a living person battered against the door, or perhaps the wind playing cruel paces. The gallery was full of wind. The door was bolted, but someone had knocked from outside. Marks pitted the wood where the knuckles had struck, and a smear of mud, brown, old as peat, streaked across the ironwork. For a moment, Evan felt, as any sensible man would, that the cliff itself had approached the tower to make its complaint. He wiped his hand across the smear and found, not soil, but what looked almost like a print of a palm, as if someone had pressed their open hand to the iron and left it as testimony. He walked the bridge in the rain the next morning. The wind cut through his jacket. The rocks below were black and slick, and the sea punched the foot of the cliff with a white, repetitive insistence. There were no footprints in the mud. There were, however, things the tide had returned: an old leather glove threaded with salt, a length of rotted rope that might once have been used to hoist a basket, rusted metal that could have belonged to the earlier lantern apparatus. The artifacts suggested a continuity he did not like to imagine. Men and equipment, some of which had likely been here longer than any living keeper. He thought then of the ledger, and of the way people leave traces of themselves when they are most afraid. He wrote in the ledger not as an act of record but of defiance. Knocks, outside, palm, ironwork, no footprints, tidal artifacts. He closed the book and felt small before the sea's appetite. The legend of Jack had teeth in the community. A retired keeper with a stiff lower back had told Evan once by the fire what he remembered from his apprenticeship. Jack was a good man, the old keeper had said. He would walk the path when the moon was thin and set his pipe down in the porch. Nothing to be afraid of. He wasn't the first to go on that rock. He'd looked at Evan as if offering him a gift. People hear things when they're alone long enough with the light. You keep seeing it because you're looking. But these explanations felt poor against the evidence of touch. Evan stopped being the man who wrote only in the ledger. He began to make small rituals of protection. He set a cup of whiskey on the sill of the lantern room, and, in the mornings, would find it half empty. He would leave a candle unlit in the gallery and find the wick slightly charred. He spoke to the place out loud, saying the names of keepers he could find in the parish records: Hugh Griffiths, James Deans, and he would sometimes say Jack's name aloud until it became a thing less frightening. One night, in the catch between seasons, when fog and moonlight played chess, Evan dreamed he was lowered in a basket over the rock. He could feel the hemp burn his palms, smell tar and seaweed, and then, suddenly, a bright pain at the back of his head, and then black. He woke with his palms damp and his throat tasting of copper. The knock woke him an hour later. This began the change. The phenomena did not stop being small things: boots, cups, whispers. They escalated as if someone wished the island to remember more acutely. Doors that had been sealed blew open. A bell that had not sounded in decades tolled once at dawn for no reason. The brass of the lens stand rattled at night, as if a great hand had dragged itself along its circumference. Visitors who came on guided tours spoke afterwards of the sense in the place, as if it were a weather pattern you passed through, heavy, attentive, and yet strangely sorrowful. Evan tried the modern solutions. He set cameras, infrared, things that blinked red on a loop. He spoke to the mainland technicians, who told him he was being careful and that there were no recorded anomalies, just the sea and the wind. One camera, when he reviewed it, showed a figure on the bridge in the amber-lit seconds before dawn, and then, when he rewound, the same frames showed nothing. The grain in the footage was as if the film itself had decided to omit something it did not like. Evan clipped the frames and saved them in a folder he could not open without feeling the weight of it. One winter's evening, with storms parked like beasts in the west, a call crackled through Evan's radio. A fishing trawler had hit the shoals and was taking on water. Details were fuzzy. Fog, a confused mayday, a faint GPS that suggested the vessel was trying to turn for shelter. The Coast Guard scrambled, and the men in the village threw on their coats and moved like a single organism toward the cliff path. Evan trained the beam and watched the searchlights of rescue craft as they cut the night into ribbons. He fed the lantern its rotation and felt, for a small, honest hour, entirely useful. A call came to the port. 2 bodies were spotted among the rocks. The rescue boats could not risk approaching the shoals where the sea locked into a chorus. Men were lowered in harnesses. Ropes were thrown. Evan stood by the parapet, teeth creaking in the cold, and watched the rescue as if it were a play. The boats clipped the horizon and something in the dark shifted. They brought a man up the path on a stretcher hours later. He had been clinging to a length of rope they found tangled in kelp. He was half frozen and half dumb with fright. He was mute for 2 days. On the 3rd, as if the ocean had decided some narrative token must be returned to the island, he spoke 1 sentence, hoarse and small. There was someone knocking. Not a conversation, not a description, just that. That small sentence travelled through the community like a coin passed between palms. Everyone looked at Evan then, as if he might provide an answer. He had none. The midnight visits of the knocks continued. They took on cadence and reason. Sometimes they came at the turn of the hour, a ritual to match the lighthouse's own wheel. Sometimes they came randomly, as if the knocker had misremembered the time. Evan slept less. He began to dream in the stuttering fragments of other people's lives, the places where a rope had been cut, a lantern unlit, a small hand left holding nothing. Then, one night, he found the gallery door unbolted. It confronted him not like a break-in, but like a permission. The latch had been pushed inward, not forced. There were no footprints on the weather-bleached iron except one, small, round, the size of a boy's palm, pressed into the metal railing. He knew immediately, in that way a person knows a storm is coming, that something would change. The knocking that followed was not angry. It was a sequence of taps, each with a quiet punctuation. Tap, pause, tap, tap. Evan answered as he had been taught as a child. 3 knocks for danger, 1 knock for a request. And he tapped back, a simple sequence he had made up that matched nothing in his ledgers. The taps paused. At that moment, a foghorn from the mainland sounded, low and resigned, like a throat clearing. A gull screamed overhead. Evan found himself saying, without thinking, "What do you want?" The answer came, not in a voice, but in a memory that ran behind his eyes like a film. He saw, in a rush, he could not stop, a man in a wet coat fighting the cliff path through gale. He saw the man's hand catch on a loose stone and then, 30 yards away, a basket swinging and a rope parting. He felt the dull, bright pain of a head striking something hard. He saw the man's chest rise and fall without sound, and the daylight dim as a cloud passed. The image stopped as quickly as it had come. Evan's hands were empty and shaking. He went to the mainland and looked through parish records, the brittle pages of documents that recorded names and small tragedies in ink that bled with age. He found a jack. He found a ledger entry. In a year of storms, a keeper had been injured by falling rock and had later died from his wounds. The details were minimal: name, date, a note, and yet the presence of a person scratched into paper was enough to make the chill in Evan's spine feel like an answered prayer. That week, the phenomena softened. The knocks became polite again. The cups remained where he left them. The cameras captured nothing out of the ordinary. People stopped asking Evan whether the lighthouse was haunted in the same curious way. They returned to their routines, a little less daring on the shore, a little kinder to the sea. Evan, though, did not grow braver. The knowledge of what he had seen was a lamp in his skull he could not smother. It taught him the mechanics of grief in a way that parish records never could. He began, slowly, to do the things Jack had not been able to do. At dawn, he lit a candle in the little chapel of the keeper's accommodation and left it until it burned to a stub. He polished the ironwork each week, running his hands where the shadow of a palm might have rested. He would press his palm to the railing and feel, sometimes, the temperature of the metal change as the sea and wind wrote and unwrote their messages. Years later, long after automation had made his post redundant and the keepers had become a memory for the younger folk who preferred overnight ferries and GPS to the ways of the island, visitors still came and asked about the knocking. They stood on the bridge with their cameras and smiled at the gulls and the basalt, and sometimes, if the wind cooperated, they claimed they heard a knuckle on wood. They would call to the empty tower, "Jack," and the sound of the sea would answer, and the lighthouse's beam would sweep across the dark like a patient, slow eye. Evan never knew whether the knocks had been a ghost, a community ritual, or some intersection of weather and memory that made the human brain prefer faces and names. That was the point of the place. It blurred the edges between practical light and human yearning until the two were as indistinguishable as salt and water. People wanted stories. People always had. And so the story of Jack persisted because it fit. It kept the island from being a mere patch of rock and turned it into the place that warns, that remembers, that asks forgiveness. In the end, perhaps, the lighthouse keeps the living too. It teaches them to watch. It makes them count steps and catalogue the small rituals that add up to being a person. To make a cup of tea and set it down, to check a lamp and wind its gears, to polish the brass until it shines like a coin. It asks the living to keep vigil, because if they do, sometimes the dead can rest. On a calm summer evening, when the flocking clouds made pictures in the sky and the sea lay like a sheet of pewter, Evan stood on the cliff path and watched the lights sweep. A young couple walked down the steps, their laughter soft as the hush of the grass. The woman tapped the man's arm and pointed at the tower. "Do you think it's true?" she asked, smiling. Evan thought of the knock, the sound like someone in the dark trying to get home, and of the man in a wet coat whose life had become a small index in the margin of the world. He thought of how stories can be shelter, and how shelters sometimes keep ghosts by accident rather than design. He only said, "Some places hold on to what they need to remember." They walked past him, and the bridge leaned like a measured fret. The light turned as it always had, an old machine's careful rotation, and in its wake the sea sighed and took another hour. Later, when the wind carried a soft, insistent tapping across the stone, and the gallery door bore a fresh, polite print, people would tell the story the way they always did, of a keeper who could not stop knocking for the things he had left undone. They would add one more line to the ledger of the village, and in the pages that men and women kept by their bedsides, and in the margins of civic minutes, Jack's story would remain. A single, patient light, and a hand that wanted only to be noticed. Under the light, it is difficult to see much beyond the obvious. You can see rocks and waves and ropes and people. But on nights when the fog takes up residence and the lamps are old and bright, you can pretend that the lighthouse keeps a different kind of ledger, one counting the hours of men and the gentle tapping of a hand at the door, asking to be let back in. The sea keeps its calendar, the lighthouse keeps its light. And sometimes, if you listen very hard as you climb the long stone steps and cross the humming bridge, you will hear a knock, 3 polite taps, and you will know the place is simply saying its name and asking, as places do, to be remembered.